we go. It's thinking about it. Done. So I'm Pospy. We're just having a bit of an informal chat about Holo-REA, and I got a bunch of folks on the call here, but not too many. So maybe we can do a quick round, and people might like to just introduce themselves real quick and let me know some of the main pressing questions you have about REA or Holo-REA or value flows, whichever piece it is you're interested in. So since you might have to run off, Christopher, do you want to start with yourself? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sure. I'm Christopher. I live in Sweden, and when I find time, I work with a project called Shiro that has to do with it's a sort of a distributed agent-centric logistics platform for the food system, and I think Holo-REA would be a good fit to serve as a base for that platform. And I would just like to listen in on you guys today that has been around for longer than I have, and yeah, hope to hear an interesting conversation.
Thanks, Chris. How about let's hear from Josh, whichever Josh Fairhead wants to speak.
Yeah, cool. I'll talk from this one then. Nice to see you guys. I'm Josh. I'm in Italy, working on a bunch of stuff, mainly identity kind of based, although I currently have some questions about events, given interest that was signaled in a call there about an hour ago to me. So yeah, that's it. I pass the stick to Daniel, maybe.
Hello, everyone. My name's Daniel Little. I am the CEO of Involvement. And basically what we do, we aim to be a fourth form of community-based investment behind government block grant funding, private corporations, and private philanthropy. What we have is a community exchange network that allows communities to tackle chronic challenges, mint currency in doing that, and then exchange the currency among local partners and businesses to get the things that they need and get their community challenges addressed. So,
thanks.
I have to pass it to somebody. There's two Joshes. Let's do.
We did the Joshes.
Yeah, let's do Michael. We get Michael?
Michael just dropped in. We're just saying hello, Michael, and letting folks know what we're interested in for this call.
Cool. Yeah. I guess I'm interested in cooperative economics and have been kind of following a bit of the Holo-REA and REA stuff, more from a distance, I guess. Like at one point wanted to be actively contributing, but then some other things have come up. But yeah, sort of following along with an interest towards how cooperative economics can maybe outcompete competitive economics for like a more harmonious future or something. Do I choose someone else?
Sure. We haven't heard from Tim, Lynn, Bob, or Jeremy yet.
Okay, let's go with Tim.
Hey there, my name's Tim. I'm in Toronto. I guess I'm most directly connected to this particular presentation through collaborating and participating with Sensorica for a few years, and you know, trying to advance infrastructure there a little bit. So I guess that's the main relevance. I'm also interested in holo technology on its own, just the architecture of that and how that relates to other kinds of similar decentralization approaches. So that's my interest. Oh, and
Awesome.
I get Bob. I guess I'll pick Bob.
Okay, so Lynn and I did a lot of work with Sensorica, and so we're happy to see them back in the fold as we move on to another architecture of Holo-REA. And I basically helped Lynn with the value flows vocabulary. So I'm gonna pass it on to Lynn.
So I'm Lynn, and I hang out with Bob, and we work together on this stuff. And yeah, my focus is the value flows, and then hanging out with projects who want to use value flows to help out. So let's see. Pospy, did you?
Oh, I did sort of, but I think we haven't heard
Oh,
from
you didn't?
Jeremy
Okay,
Boom
so
either. If Jeremy's near his
Jeremy?
mic, he said he might be coming and going. Here we go.
Hey,
Hey.
hey, I'm just here. I'm doing some other work, but I just wanted to follow along a little bit. But yeah, just really interested in Holo-REA, and yeah, I haven't got much to say. Thanks.
Cool. Well, we've got Tim in the room here, so I thought it might be cool. He says it wouldn't be good from a marketing perspective, but I'm not interested in the marketing perspective, and I'm not sure the rest of us are anyway. It would be very cool just to hear a little bit about what collaborating with Sensorica has been like, and your experience with the NRP system, and maybe you could give a little bit of background for people that aren't familiar with Sensorica on what that style of collaboration looks like. That'd be really cool to start.
And feel free, Bob and I can take it. We can take it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
okay.
can pass the torch as much as we want.
By the way, I also emailed Tiberius, so Tiberius must have just received 5 emails. I provided him the link to the Zoom and everything here, so he's yeah. But now he's really in trouble because I'm on the spot with this one. Yeah, the reason I said that about the marketing wasn't any particular, heaping on of any kind of criticism or anything about the technology or the NRP thing. So no worries there. It's mostly, I guess. Sensorica is an open value network, which is an early kind of an effort trying to unpack and open up for, I guess, inspection, interrogation, intervention, the definitions that people define around the value in terms of how they define value around projects and programs and activities and initiatives and collaboratives and collectives and what have you that they might get involved in to try to accomplish something in the world. So, I guess for myself personally, I was attracted to it because I've been sort of focused on what I would call responsible innovation for many years, and the idea of innovation that serves not just the next fidget spinner is the example I always tend to use, but innovation that actually achieves some significant, constructive, positive benefits. People use all the words triple bottom line, and now it's of course with, I think, things like climate change and this kind of a thing, and increasing surfacing of issues, it's becoming more mainstream to try to synthesize a more holistic view of innovation and not just techno science and that kind of thing. So that's what originally it was, that sort of intention that took me to Sensorica in the first place, because it looked like a place where this kind of thing could be instrumentalized and implemented in a really sophisticated way, pretty sophisticated way. So my experience of Sensorica, though, I will just say mostly is mediated through collaboration with Tiberius. So I mainly work with him on proposals or consultation papers or organizing and coordinating with this Open Climate Collabathon event, which I think we met at. Basically, that's part of how this came to be, I guess, this presentation. And so things like that. And the NRP for me has always just been kind of something as a first generation of something that needs to have a second generation and a third generation, what have you. So, I think another thing I'm involved in, I guess, separately is community networks, community networking, and mesh networking. I'm part of organizing a community mesh network in Toronto here. We received some significant funding from the Internet Society to acquire our equipment. And so we were about to deploy last week. We were going to be on rooftops last week all around Toronto. But because of a lockdown here, that got shut down. But it will proceed after the lockdown is lifted and people are willing to go and do this. That's, I guess, a reason of what I'm getting at is in terms of offline first. I was originally introduced to this whole kind of community through partly Secure Scuttlebutt, and as an offline first kind of a computing platform that has some interesting advantages in certain situations where mesh networking and community networks exist in different parts of the world or in different operational situations. And so that idea was interesting, and that's something that I find attractive about Holo as well. Sort of this idea I understand of offline and then heal back into the network and this kind of thing, as well as the subjective aspects of kind of like the DNA notion. I think has some interesting possibilities that haven't even been explored yet. So that's kind of where I'm coming at. So I didn't say a lot about the NRP, so I didn't necessarily answer your question, but I tried to say a lot of words all together at once that had some relevance to this. So there you go.
That was great. Thank you. Has the direction of Sensorica changed all that much over the last 10 years in your view? Like it was, to me, it was always kind of described as, we're a distributed collective of hardware manufacturers, and that was pretty open in the beginning, but I think recently it's kind of narrowing in on sensors in particular. And
not really. That's a good question. So there's two things kind of going on, I guess. So there's a custodial agreement. There's an organization which is the custodian of the Sensorica network, and that's kind of one of the places where Tiberius sort of innovated to try to solve some of the legal agreements to allow this kind of financing, the kind of thing that Open Collective now does, right? So that's one approach. So the Open Value Network has always been more of the central focus for me or my involvement. And the notion of open hardware, I do have a background in hardware and software, but that was not what attracted me, anything to do with sensors or hardware. And it's become more of, in a way, if you look at the communities page on Sensorica, that's a little more better indication of what Sensorica is becoming now. So we've been helping, and that's when I met Josh, Patrick, try to kind of seed a new community, good labs off of there. So that idea of focusing on open value networks, and I don't know if you ever looked at the conation.net in my email. It's a focus on facilitating the kind of proliferation of these kinds of networks with this kind of sophisticated infrastructure under them to achieve as a medium for achieving some things. As opposed to a specific, there you go. So this was a conversation.
Go with graphics.
Yeah, perfect. We had a conversation about this. So there is a shift actually to, you see Sensorica IoT and smart systems. That's the one Sensorica you referred to, the Sensorica Value Network focused on sensors. But the container in which it's appearing here, the Sensorica at the top that says peer into the future, that is a federation of open value networks in a way. So
wow, okay, I didn't know that. So you really have grown into the network of networks, as Bob likes to call it.
Yeah, undertook an involution of types, I suppose. So that's
Thanks
sort
for
of
sharing that.
Yeah.
I thought we could just kind of have a bit of an explore around the software off the back of that. So this is the homepage for the NRP that it's got about 10, 12 years of history in this piece of software now, doesn't it? So from your perspective, I'm curious how many of these parts of NRP you actually touch routinely. Like I imagine all the modeling the network stuff are things that you haven't really played with and needed to see because it's all been mostly set up and running stably since before you arrived. But is this kind of part of the flow of orders and planning, produce and coordinate, exchange and distribute? Is that all still kind of the main operational flows that you work in?
This is the part that I said would not make a good marketing presentation because I don't personally enter any information into this system.
Okay, yeah. So you're floating in the human layer more than the software layer.
Yeah, let's say that, or not this software layer. Okay, there you go, gotcha. Lynn. That's a little jab.
Well, that's quite interesting, actually. So where do the other software layers kind of embed and integrate into this and sit outside of it?
Yeah, no, sorry. If you're talking about the intersection of Sensorica and software layers,
Mhm.
yeah, this is the only software layer going. But I just meant in terms of looking at other software possibilities. So, yeah, I guess I'm doing a lot of writing. I'm not working necessarily on the open hardware projects and logging time and acquiring equipment and utilizing the 3D printer. I don't attend the physical lab. I'm in Toronto and the lab is in Montreal. So there's also that. But Tiberius continues to use the NRP diligently, and as do some others, I'm sure. And the data is very valuable, and I think we'd like to, uh, uh, you know, retain the data and carry it over to new systems.
Yeah, okay, that's good to know. I mean, I would presume that the writing and things get logged as, yeah, there's some writing work logged in here. So I wonder if this is maybe some of your audit trail being logged on your behalf.
Yeah, Tiberius will sometimes log me doing things too.
I suppose a big point to make here is just looking at the interface. It's aging a bit, and I suspect that that's part of the reason for this kind of thing. That it's just a lot of UI that people have gotten used to over the years, but it's not necessarily that good. So dealing with it is a bit hard and a bit of a learning curve for new people, is my suspicion.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
again, I'm not a good example of or how to discuss using this. My involvement has been more on innovating on the organization and the institution and the machinery of the institution itself, rather than applying it to do hardware.
There is a question on that that kind of goes into the software a little bit, and it's around the contributory accounting model of the organization, or just the contribution model. I'm curious to reflect if you know, because the way it used to work, in my understanding, was that people would just log any available work inside Sensorica. And then if you wanted to do the work, it was open to anybody and you could just pick it up. And that contrasts a little bit with the way that the value flows spec has evolved, because these days there's an initial step where you can log an intention for something to happen. But the intention was more kind of implicit with Sensorica, because it was just assumed if the work was there that Sensorica intended to do it. So I wonder, as Sensorica has grown and as it's sort of federated into more networks that are all related, has that approach shifted at all to being more of a deliberate kind of starting point for a project? Or is it still running pretty free form where people just log stuff and it gets picked up and no one really governs like the starting of the project versus the gathering input and soliciting people's interest phase, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, I think in terms of the software use, it's still applied probably in that way you described first about just contributing, but the controls that you're talking about around or the more negotiation of scope and focus and collaboration that you speak to about organizing some kind of governance, that's really happening in more of a documentation layer, not in the software itself, but with standard structures of documents where and you know, stigmergy is the big concept around that Tiberius is often trying to proliferate and get people to use. And so in the documentation, there's a lot of guidance around how to approach things, and that's where you would find something that might mitigate sort of an unbridled, sort of more chaotic concerns you might have around things where there's no cohesion. That's done in the documents. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I might jump into a bit of a show and tell, and I'll try to keep it fairly non-technical. But I could start just by kind of contrasting. So this is these are actually links into the system, but this is what the dashboard for NRP looks like at the moment. And this is a slide from a presentation I gave at the Open Climate Collaborathon the other week, which many of you may have seen. That's kind of the reason we sparked this call. But yeah, just a slightly different breakdown of the features here. This is kind of more technical and specific to Sensorica maybe. This is me trying to look at it from a high level as to what are the actual features that this piece of software provides. I guess number one, I'm curious from any Sensoricans if there's a glaring omission in this, that there's a significant feature you think that NRP offers that I haven't outlined here. But I think I've got most of them all. And so the ones that are ticked are the ones that Holo-REA has already implemented in the older version of Holochain. We're going through a bit of an update at the moment. So yeah, a few things about that. One, the modularization of the larger system. So Sensorica's NRP is just, it does so much and it's so big and complicated that the likelihood of other folks implementing a similar system is quite low because of just all that complexity to bite off, although Commons Pub / Bonfire are doing it, so good for them. So splitting it up just means that then we can have value flows compatible systems that may not be as all encompassing as Sensorica's, and still be interoperable with those specific pieces that they're using. So someone could have a system that just does the event ledger and observations, which is just economic events and processes, and you could run that as a totally valid value flows compatible event ledger and have it interact with other value flows systems without having to build, planning and coordinating and agreements and proposals and all the other stuff as well, which doesn't have relevance in a lot of contexts. So that's one thing that we could talk about in some depth. The other is we could just kind of go into the code and reflect on what some of the implications of the Holochain architecture look like. And I think they're going to be kind of straightforward for people to kind of, we'll be probably figuring them out as we talk. But yeah, there's some we can explore in terms of what is offered now versus what was offered then, where the similarities and differences lie. Is there anything else in particular that people are really interested in exploring as we go through all that? The sound of comfort there. Okay, cool. So lots to talk about then. Yeah, Holochain architecture is coming through the chat. So I guess I can start by talking about how the modularity happens in Holochain versus this kind of architecture, which means I'm going to have to jump out of here into code somewhere. So, sorry, sorting out my screens. Yeah, this should do us. So those modules that you were all just looking at in the presentation deck. So this is the actual code base now. If you go to github/holo-rea, you'll find the repository. And the first place I want to talk about in here is inside this HAPS folder that sits at the top level. So that was, HAPS was the perhaps obvious cool trendy name that people started giving to Holochain applications. So each of these folders in here, we've got agent, agreement, observation, planning, proposal, and specification. So there's a correspondence there to the modules that I was showing in the diagram before. And each of these is just its own standalone Holochain DNA is the term they use, but you can think of it as a standalone network kind of thing. So each of them has one of these JSON files, and some of them, I'm not sure which ones are going to have them actually. And what I've done, there's these properties attributes that you can put in the file, and they're kind of dynamic. So you can use them as like, in a blockchain system, you'd call it a genesis block, but it's like the configuration that the network starts with. And so for things like agent, where it's going to be eventually managing groups of agents, there might be some properties there that specify who are the agents that have access to begin with, and then they'd have to provide access to more people to grow the network in. So so you have these properties are kind of like the dynamic bit, which means that I can then go and create many instances of each of these networks and run them separately. So I could have 100 different networks running observation if I want. And the properties, as well as the code that makes up the network, in which case the code is within here in all of these zones, which are kind of the separate, you can really just think of them as libraries within the network. And each of them has a little bit of storage logic and entry definitions and things in it. So those familiar with value flows will see a bunch of things in this list that they're familiar with. So there's a network here that specially just does the observation stuff. So this is the event ledger piece. And so quite central to that is the economic event records. And there are these little modules in that look like this in the older Holochain. The new one's a little bit more succinct. But they really just register, there's things about initializing the network and validating who can join, definitions for the types of data we're storing, and then a bunch of API function names, basically. So from a traditional web services perspective, these are just little standalone microservices, like you might build in a Node.js cluster or something like that. The difference is that each of these in the conductor for Holochain yet to come, and all the kind of run the node software that people install, there's sort of like a browsable store for these kinds of things, and you can just locate them, click them with one click, and they're installed. And there's very little else you have to do. The built-in Genesis kind of callbacks, it's actually handled in here. But this default one is going to first, I think, look for peers on local networks, and then it checks on Cloudflare, and using Cloudflare's infrastructure, they can do a bunch of peer discovery there. But that's the other significant thing about this, is that you're running each of these networks yourself on your own machine, and they discover and connect to other people running them, and you all manage your own storage, and you all share data entirely peer-to-peer. And that's it. There's no other servers in the middle or other infrastructure to set up. So yeah, I'm not sure what else to tell you about that. I can just pause for questions for a little bit, because I haven't gone very deep in any of that. Please shout out at any time if there's things you want me to go into or curiosities you have as we talk. Perhaps the other things that are interesting about this are that there's some sort of splitting of information across different networks. So in value flows, we have records like fulfillment and satisfaction, and these are actually things that refer to two different records. So a satisfaction can refer to the relationship between a commitment and an intent. So we say that, this thing that I wanted to happen has been satisfied by someone else saying they're going to make it happen. Or it can be between an event and an intent. So you can say that the thing that you wanted to happen has been satisfied by something actually happening. And in that case, when I've started to pull this apart into separate network spaces, it gets interesting, because a satisfaction, depending on which side of the network you have access to, like if you're in the planning space, there's no guarantee that you can see the observation space where things are actually being recorded. And the same in the observation space. There's no guarantee that you can see the planning space. And I think I've got a test in here that sort of shows it. Yeah, use that error. So if you go into the test folder of this repository, there's a social architectures one that's starting to try to put together some more kind of high-level businessy type scenarios that might make sense. And this one is interesting because I haven't written any new code at all to do this. It's just using these network modules as they are. But what I'm doing is starting here by setting up a whole different bunch of networks and giving them different labels. So you can see I've got like a planning network here that's for the customer, and I've got a planning network here that's for the export management company, another one that's for subcontractors. And there's some other bits in here where, okay, maybe the export management company, they don't actually have an observation network. Maybe they don't need to track the actual physical things of what's happening. Maybe that gets done in a different network. So in this way of kind of decomposing the NRP into smaller pieces, suddenly they can be reassembled in very different ways that we haven't done in the past. And this one's showing some things like, I've got a customer who has their own marketplace that they kind of make purchases within, but they can also see into the observations that the courier and the import officials are making. This is a cross-border trade example. So there's ways in Holochain that we can kind of get access to all these disparate networks and then assemble them together in ways that might make sense now that previously we could do it, but we just would have had a lot of dead weight in the system, like different modules that weren't being used by other people just sitting there. And yeah, so this whole approach kind of shows a lot of things, other things that Holochain can do around permission and replication of data. There was this idea in this this network that we have this official who actually kind of was part of bridging the air gap, and the particular case study that this came on was talking about imports into China. So they obviously have the Great Firewall in the middle, and they don't want people accessing their networks. So you can actually just have a setup where someone's been permissioned into both networks and they can carry the data with them, and it can all replicate and synchronize into the new network, which can be pretty interesting in some of these inter-organizational scenarios. So yeah, looking at that at a low level, when you dig down into the satisfactions here, there's not a lot different in the planning network, but if you look in observation, you'll see it has its own satisfaction as well. And satisfaction in here, it actually has these methods that are in the past tense. So they're kind of methods that are being called by this network when things happen here. So if I create a satisfaction somewhere within this handler, if I jump right down into it, you'll see here it's creating an index, and got some older code here, creating an index, and that fires off a whole bunch of logic that's actually talking at the Holochain layer between Holochain networks. And I think that's kind of worth a small mention, that it really complicates the ontology issues with all this stuff, because then if I'm back to this example, back down in the tests here, like if I am this export management company and I'm asking the subcontractor to do some work, there's no real guarantee that the kinds of work that I'm talking about when I'm doing the planning as the export management company are the same types of work that this subcontractor understands in their own planning network. So there's a need to have quite a robust ontological translation capability that can happen at the boundaries between networks, so that when this replication occurs and I've said, the work that I'm going to do in my collective is going to satisfy the work request that some external person made to us, there need to be things in place so that that category of work gets translated and understood as it's replicated out to the other network. And that's a big area that Holochain hasn't really gone into yet. I think we have enough of the answers in the design as to how that works. I think it's pretty clear it is what you'd expect. It's just a mapping of network IDs and then where the ontologies translate between, which is just, organic avocados here becomes organic nitrate-free avocados over there kind of thing. That's really all it is. But I think in larger ecosystems, we're going to see emerging just ways that people will configure that and share those configurations, because I imagine Sensorica, looking at that network map before, there's a whole bunch of collaborators that you have existing relationships with and do work with. And probably at the moment, they're all using NRP in the same instance. So all of their ontologies all align because they're all using the same definitions. So there might be some pre-existing agreements that get set up to manage those transfers. I had something else on that. There is something that can be done. Yeah, the other thing that can be done more automatically is that you can just take this this specification module here, which is the network space where you define all your resource types and work types. So you can take that and make it a broader network space that more people in the network have access to. So in Sensorica's case, all those organizations could be using the same network that has the same ontology information as to all of the work and product types. But they could still all be using different independent planning and observation and work management spaces. So all of that is possible. And with a little bit of work on sort of, it's mainly just on how permissions flow through. But one of the early user stories that Tiberius had for us was, you know, I'm in an organization, I want to be able to split out a project as something that that organization has access to. And then I want to be able to take that project and include some other organization that wasn't part of this one. And with this kind of fractal network architecture, that's pretty easy to do because you're just cloning out new networks that might draw some data in. And then at the point of including others, you're just widening permissions. And this is now its own network space, an own collaboration entity with its own, membrane roles that people have in it. And it has all of the same access controls and powers as the parent Sensorica organization as a whole, because they're all using really the same exact network code. Yeah, any questions for now? I feel like I'm talking a lot. Or is there anything Lynn and Bob would like to add at this point in the game?
No, I don't have anything to add. Nice going through. I'm thinking through some of this stuff because there's little bits of this that I haven't thought about yet either, and so time for for another discussion. But nothing to add.
Okay, sure. We had some questions about mesh networking and offline first, so those are kind of worth reflecting on, I think. Yeah, as someone mentioned, Holochain takes that same local first model. So when you're doing stuff within a Holochain DNA, you're doing it all locally first, and then it syncs to the network and replicates out. It also means that there's the chance of partitions happening in data. So two people have access to the same economic resource, say, and I go off somewhere where there's no network connection, and I decide that I want to use up some of that resource, and so I log that. But meanwhile, someone else does it. That might result in the conflict in the way that I'm storing the data. Like it doesn't necessarily have to. And another benefit of this modularity that we might explore down the track is that we can actually create different implementations of different modules. And so in Ventry at the moment, all of the resource accounting happens inside of the observation module, but it seems sensible that at some point we might want to pull the inventory management stuff away from observation, because there are many people that just want to track, categories of things that are moved. They don't actually track inventory and the things they've got on hand. But doing that also means that we could implement an event sourcing inventory that doesn't ever actually write the resources and only derives them when you query them back out based on the events. So for those not familiar, that is kind of one of the core parts of the value flows model, is that it takes the perspective that the data is just a mirror of reality, and the data is only as good as the observations that are made. So you never actually indicate or dictate anything about a resource directly in REA. You only say, oh, I observed that there are 4 more of these things than there were, and that adjusts the resource quantities and accounting for you. So there's 2 models where if you just don't store the resources all and pull them at query time, it means that you never have to have those kind of conflicts, because if I remove 2 and you remove 1 and then the network rejoins, then it'll just go, oh, we've removed 3. But if there was 1 resource in inventory at the time that happened, and we're storing records, then one of those says, well, you can't because you've gone below 0, and the other one says it's okay. So there are different use cases, and probably around the mutual credit currency space are the ones where we don't care about going into negative balances and would just allow it. But I do wonder, even in those places where whether we might like to track some record just to create the alert that a conflict happened, because that might be important in that process. It might indicate someone trying to overspend. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about that, to be honest. What else is important about mesh networking? I mean, I guess it just means that you can deploy these systems in low connectivity environments and they can keep running fine. It also means that you can do off-grid capable economic interaction. And I think most of the cases where you do that are fairly high trust environments, but this will let you do it in a lower trust environment as well. Yeah, it's quite exciting just being in the loop about where the lower parts of this stack are heading in that regard. Like Holochain's working to be extremely resource efficient. They're talking about hundreds of nodes, and by nodes they mean networks in this case, running on a Raspberry Pi. The other thing that's been interesting lately is folks in my village have been setting up a fiber interchange and kind of doing like a village fiber network. So places like that, and places where you're doing it with Wi-Fi as well, you can have an entirely self-contained coordination system that never goes down, even if the external internet goes down. So that's a little bit new. Like, to do that with a federated system, I think you need to have some on-premise server admin to run the server, basically, for that same thing to work. So that's quite exciting to me. Yeah, I don't know. Jeremy, have you got any other questions on mesh networking? Was it you or was it Tim? I can't remember. If there's any sort of...
Yeah, I think I might have mentioned it. Yeah.
Yeah. If you've got any burning questions or like particular use cases you're trying to fit, I'd be curious to bounce them back and forth.
You know, just off the top of my head, so it's not necessarily an important question or a good one anyway, but it's the curiosity that's kind of just emerging as I listen is whether or not the Holo folks responsible for those lower layers have a simulator, do some kind of simulation. Because the first question I would have would be kind of about the reconnection healing process, putting that through a whole bunch of sensitivity to different conditions about latencies and how many nodes and how, you know, that would be the first kind of thing I would think to do to prove the scalability and the viability of it, you know. Then I just wonder if that's, you know, how do you get insight into how well different magnitudes of data intensive apps or what have you, or different kinds of workload profiles in an operating realistic real world size kind of a you know, Holo app, you know, how do they perform when they reconnect, you know, and are there like conditions, like different kinds of, you mentioned that collisions with data or the partitioning, but I wonder if there's other kinds of new kinds of confusions that we create for ourselves in that reconnecting, you know, connecting back into the more global, you know, network.
Sure. I can give you a bit of a technical answer to that and a bit of the sysops answer to that. I know Holochain, they've been benchmarking it fairly heavily, and of late those benchmarks have moved more into the production hardware that they're building for. So they did in their crowd launch, it was kind of this whole interesting process they went through on how do you do an ethical ICO. So they did a Kickstarter first and sold a bunch of these embedded hardware devices that are, you know, like, you don't need them. You can use any Linux box. But they, I think they're based on Banana Pi, so really quite small units. And that was like a gauge for them as to, well, you know, people that pre-order these things are going to be actually interested in using the network. So that can be the pre-allocation in the crowd sale. And they're now benchmarking across that network with a chat app that they've developed as kind of like their first MVP. But I mean, I know some other folks, Guillaume Cordova's built a file upload app that can take files in up to 4 terabytes. So he's going to be thrashing it with large amounts of data at some point. Even in the first prototype, someone built a video streaming app that was basically functional. So the speed is pretty good. I'll drop in the chat the module you'd want to check out. They wrote this thing that they call Triorama, which is like the Node.js client for testing that talks to Holochain. And you just use it with a real Holochain node. I don't think there is even like a test node kind of thing, because there isn't really any point. This thing's just meant to orchestrate talking through the WebSocket. Yeah, Triorama, and they're sort of rewriting it as well for the new Holochain. So there'll be some of the features that you need to do this stuff that aren't present yet, I expect. But they have been present and they will be present again. And it's those things like having methods to take one of your test peers and disconnect them from the network so that you can then run a bunch of transactions with them being absent, and then run another method that reconnects. So yeah, all of that stuff is scriptable and can be done in a test, and you can do flood testing and things like that way. So that's the tooling you want to play with if you want to explore that. What else? Oh yeah, in terms of the technicalities of how all that works and how Holochain apps maintain their integrity despite partition tolerant faults and stuff. The significant feature that Holochain has that something like say Scuttlebutt doesn't have is that it's a validating DHT. So when you receive data from another peer, there's validation logic that's baked into your network code that runs. And if the validation doesn't pass, then the data won't be written to your machine. And whereas in Scuttlebutt, it does some schema validation, but that's about it. And the data will always end up on your machine. So you've got no way to kind of reject something malicious coming towards you. And in their trust model and kind of human-centered internet, it works well. But in Holochain's trust model and idea of human-centered internet, the trust is actually a little bit looser. So yeah, and the way that looks in code is that for each entry type that you store on the chain, they just have a validation callback that runs that can have whatever logic you want in it. And yeah, that's kind of all it really needs to have. But it becomes interesting when you start going, well, I want to validate that this thing has been here since this other piece of data arrived. And it turns out that you can't really, because you know the fact of the other piece of data arriving might be faulty and it might have not synced yet. So doing those kind of validations that depend on different records are not very easy. But the way to work around that is often that due to the nature of distributed data, most things are hash addressed. So if you've got the hash to something, then you know that it already exists because you wouldn't have the hash otherwise. And so that as a mechanism for storing relationships between records has been very effective in my findings. It did also, these realities kind of bubbled up into the protocol layer actually. And so the value flows GraphQL spec, which is the API binding that Holo-REA and Bonfire and hopefully others talks to the UI. I'll pop it in the chat, a link to that project. But we're going through something at the moment where, okay, if you've got a system where a conflict can happen at any point after I've authored the information, then there's always a possibility of a conflict. So for one, you need to be able to return some error if a record that you're trying to be accessing has conflicted. And for two, you need some guarantee that when you're updating or changing information, that information hasn't changed in the meantime. And due to the nature of this platform, there are no such guarantees. And the way that seems to be being addressed, and that's becoming more common, and that makes a lot of sense to me, is that updates and deletes happen by the revision ID rather than the record ID. And I'm kind of speaking in old world terms of that, because the idea of revisions and records is something that doesn't really exist anymore, and I'm kind of emulating in Holochain. But there's still, I think, abstractions that you need. Like if you have a real computer system, it has data that changes over time. So how do you model that and how do you deal with it is the big question with a distributed architecture. Yeah, so basically what we're doing now is there's some changes so that updates and deletes will happen based on the version. And that means that it's always explicitly clear which exact version you're modifying. And so in the case that you have a conflict, what will happen is the error returns, these are the IDs that are in conflict. And then anyone that has permission to edit those records just has to go and update them so that they're all the same again. And then they'll no longer conflict, and the hash chain converges again, and you've got consensus and you can keep going. And I think that's probably the minimum viable way of addressing it. There are more complicated things we can do where we actually build interface to diff records and things, but I don't want to impose that complexity on every UI developer at this stage, especially when you've got systems like Bonfires, because they're a federated system that has a central database. They don't have these kinds of problems, so they can include some revision IDs, but they don't really need to. So it's an extra bit of protocol that we just have to find the intersection for between all these different types of systems.
Kind of prompts another question about maybe let's call it a hybrid architecture, because some of the abstractions that you referred to, you're reaching into relational databases and what have you for inspiration. Is there much talk around the Holochain water cooler about ways that this fits in as a component to larger architectures which do employ relational databases or centralized servers, hub spoke for certain architectural elements, like for instance, like security trimming, or, some of these things. And about that sort of thing, I hear you about the local and person first and differences in conceptions of the trust models compared to blockchain and zero trust, quote unquote. But there's just some operational systems of, economic operational systems where someone might come to work in a certain group and then leave that group, and then you want to control some kind of access there. So I guess that question's actually not heading so much into specifics of access control, but things like access control that get built into, a big benefit of something like SharePoint that people would point to is the ready security trimming. Boom, it's there. It's all in the. It's in the.
Can you explain security trimming?
The idea about when you look at this on your screen, the fact that me as an administrator or creator was able to narrow the range of fields that you might have visibility to. So depending on your profile, I'm able to trim what gets visible to. But what I'm getting at, I guess, is a lot of those kind of utility things, those architectural things that usually come out as like, add-ons or libraries or components of whole suites, like a thing like a SharePoint. Is there a fractioning of the supply chain you see in the Holochain universe, where some people will focus on trying to solve those with what we would have called class libraries or component libraries and things like this? And do you see there being a market that follows that kind of development arc as we've seen in the past, where there becomes a community of developers who mainly are delivering frameworks to be used by app developers and solve some of these specific problems? And I'm trying to hear the story of viability. I'm trying to hear the story of long-term viability and evolution based on this DNA.
Okay. I think the answer is yes, and I think and hope that will be the way that it functions. I'll send a link through down into the chat. There's this resource booking module that Guillaume has been working on. So I'm mentioning Guillaume's name a lot. He's fairly prolific in building little Holochain modules at the moment. But yeah, this is an interesting one because it started as a non-REA project and it was just about booking rooms availability. And now we've had some chats, and he's gone into updating it so that it's going to talk to REA, and then we describe the rooms themselves as REA resources, and then it starts to integrate into this whole ecosystem. But it's because these are like nice, neat, small microservices. That's a fairly small piece of work, and the only thing that Guillaume is really working on is like the logic of calendar events and how you manage dates into the future and all that stuff. And then pretty much at the point that you in that application click, yes, I want to book this room, then it sends off a request into the Holo-REA system that's logging an intent to be using that resource for these hours. And so, that push of data into value flows being driven by this kind of controller module that does that management is very much the kind of ecosystem that we've always seen being built around this. And actually this link that's been around for ages on modules in the Holo-REA framework, and just us sort of brainstorming into what we were going to include in this. And there's plenty of higher order things in there that are not yet built that I think would fit in that same space as little add-on things, like the value equation component of Sensorica and the income distribution is one of those. But there's also things like, having a little module so that we can do dispute resolution in some networks where there might be those kind of trust issues if it's a business network. So yeah, there's all those little pieces. In the converse, there's also the smaller pieces than Holo-REA that I have not built and have never had any intention of building, but because of the nature of the Holochain ecosystem, they just get built. So the file uploads one is one of those, and like it may be that the file uploads module is designed to be an attachment, so you can just kind of take any identifier and upload a file against it. But even if it's not, maybe you just need to create another module that just manages links between things, and then you can make file attachments out of file uploads plus link management, and then I can just link files into whatever stuff in REA I want. And all of that composition can all just be done in the client. And I'm doing it in GraphQL, but only because I'm using GraphQL as the API bindings. Yeah, assembling Holochain network components like that out of different microservices is incredibly easy to do, and that's really where the platform starts to shine. In terms of the partial disclosure kind of stuff, we have thought about that, haven't built it yet, but I think those are fairly simple modules as well. Like if you consider that observation one that I was showing before as being, that might be within a collective and it has the full information. But it's pretty easy to build another module that does like observation redacted that has the same records, but they don't have provider and receiver agent IDs in them. So they've been anonymized. And you could just have it configured so that whenever an event gets logged in this network, this one's listening and the data gets replicated across. And then this network space can be the thing that we permission less central members of a collective into, so that they can see that events have happened, but they can't see who made the event. So yeah, you can do those kinds of ways of extending and hiding information. And I kind of favor those because there are other ways that you can sort of partition information within a network. But the problem with that, it's not really a problem depending on who you ask. There's a great concept I came across a while ago that I like to talk about in these cases of, is your network space an eco network or an ego network? And the idea being that in an eco network, everybody has this kind of high trust and they all know the rules of the game and they use the tech responsibly together. But in an eco network, it's individualistic and people just want to, get the advantage and sneak peeks at data they shouldn't have access to and stuff. So the way that you organize these network membranes has an impact on the availability of information in that way, because if I'm part of a network space, then I am then sharing data that's being sharded across the DHT that we all share. And I might have some data sitting on my machine that I actually am not supposed to have access to. And so in those cases, if it's really, really critical that someone can't just sniff pieces of data, then you want to make sure that they actually don't have access to that network space at all, because if they're part of it, even if things are being hidden from it, they might be replicating information behind the scenes. Does that answer most of those questions?
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, cool. It raises the other question around the self-conception of Holo in terms of to what degree is it not attempting to replicate the past? To what degree is it trying to innovate and strike new directions in some of these areas that may narrow the application, but nevertheless it represents actually just a new outlook on what should or could be done. So that's an open question.
Well, what comes to mind when you say that, the biggest one that has been is the group agent stuff. And Lynn and Bob and I, especially Bob, have had lots of long conversations on the Holochain forum and with Art Brock about how do we do groups, because the really strong ideology they're pushing is that everything is about individual agency and it all, that's the foundation. And we have some pretty good ideas now for APIs of how you build membership and groups out of these pieces, but even that's been really interesting, seeing the different ways that people approach it. And I think now most of us are kind of switched on to the idea of network spaces as the permission layer. So, that your presence in the network space determines what you have access to, and you can kind of organize permissions around just the ways you combine networks. But in the early days, a lot of people were still thinking about, I'm in this network and I have this role. So, this person is the admin of the network and this person is the office assistant, and the office assistant shouldn't be able to see these things. And yeah, those I think have less applicability here.
Okay, thanks.
In terms of your other question about Holochain and the broader world and how it interoperates, one thing that's quite nice is that unlike any blockchain systems where your transaction logic has to be fully deterministic, because I first encountered this yonks ago, way back with Hyperledger. But if you have a blockchain that needs all the data to be totally consistent with everybody all the time, it means that any logic that you run in the blockchain, if it can be different for two people, like if there's something in there that says put in the current time, and that's different for two people, then you have a consistency error because you end up with two different sets of data as they execute the same transaction. And Holochain, that doesn't matter, because there's kind of a two-phase thing that happens where when you make a request into Holochain, all of that logic only gets run on your own local machine. It never gets run anywhere else. And it's only once you've written data to the network that then that gets replicated to people and they run their own validation on the data. So the pattern for Holochain apps since the beginning has been, heavy on validation, light on logic. And there were even apps where people had no application logic at all. It was just validation rules. And so, the client was kind of up to them to figure out the right way to interact with it. But yeah, it's quite important for this reason, because you have no way of trusting that anyone else is running the same code. And so you might end up with them requesting to put any data on the DHT. So that's where you need to validate your business rules in terms of the actual data. And it's almost in programming terms like a precondition, post-condition kind of thing on the data. Like you literally specify this condition has to be met and it stays that way. But the side effect of all of that is that I can do weird stuff in my Holochain requests. Like I can go and talk to an external web service, or I can, pull the latest time from my system clock, or I can talk to this other blockchain that's got different state depending on the time I look at it. And you can do all that, and there's no issue with the system because that phase doesn't need to be consistent. So at a Holochain layer, talking to other platforms and making requests out to the web and doing all that stuff is doable. And because Rust is such a low-level language, it's usually doable quite fast, I find. But it's actually kind of more of a question from this perspective for me as to how we do the connections outside of Holochain. So that GraphQL repo again, it was all about, well, not all about, but some of the features in that are about being able to generate the schema with only some of the modules selected, so that I can, say that there's a collaboration space over here. It's just a marketplace, so I can load it up and know that it's just got planning and proposal in it, which are the REA pieces that markets need. But the other thing that it does not yet do, but I think is pretty easy to write some helpers for, is say I've got, I'm the member of a local regional food marketplace, but I'm also the member of like a larger food logistics network that like a big multinational grocery chain is running, say. So how do I search for products across both of those marketplaces? And I think we will end up doing this in the client rather than in Holochain. and that's because of the portability thing and the talking to other systems thing, because it means that then we can take a value flows GraphQL API binding that talks to a bonfire instance that has their own economic stuff going on, and I can take another one that talks to a Holo-REA network that's got this regional marketplace, and I can take another one that's a Holo-REA network that's the multinational distribution network, and then just compose them all together and query them all as if they're the same API. And to do that without any of the UI code needing to be aware that that's happened. So all of the UI widgets are just saying, get me all of the marketplace listings. But underneath that, there's actually a whole bunch of different collaboration spaces and networks being queried to pull the data out. And that's when things get quite exciting for me. And that's when we can start doing, you know, an application that does REA collaboration that works between a web server and Holochain. And I mean, Luandre's got the scuttlebutt version of this as well as a little prototype. So yeah, there are potentially ways, I think, that are getting close to being real where all this stuff can work together very easily. Just looking in the chats. I'm not even, Bob has a question on object capabilities, saw them mentioned in the Holochain docs. Are they coming up? I haven't seen them mentioned. Can you explain object capabilities to me?
Yeah, Josh Fairhead answered me and said he's seen them on the roadmap. So object capability, and somebody, maybe with Josh, actually explained them. And so I would like to hand it over to whoever started to do the explanation and sit and listen.
It's you, Josh.
Yeah. Yeah, so my understanding is that Holochain capabilities, and it's the basic security model of Holochain. And I think that's where your agent key of your source chain is. Something along those lines. I'm not that technical. So capabilities are the inverse of an access control list. So capabilities versus permissions. Permissions are a top-down, require certificate authorities, and gave rise to the likes of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. Capabilities, however, were a Xerox PARC thing from, I think, 69 or so, and they're a bottom-up thing. It's down to a subject-object relationship and how you compress a matrix. It's either that way or that way. And by compressing it one way or the other, it would seem perfectly symmetrical, but it gives rise to a huge amount of unintended consequences. And yeah, that's probably shaped us the last 50 years, unfortunately. Is there anything I missed or you want to know about them? You can drop a link for
Yeah, thank you. So I could add one more thing, which is that object capabilities are also being implemented in ActivityPub. So likewise, value flows are being implemented in ActivityPub networks. So we'll have these two different networks, Holochain and ActivityPub, the Fediverse, that will have both value flows and for economic communication between them, and also object capabilities for security, for access control. So in both those cases, Christopher Weber of the ActivityPub gang has done a lot of work with object capabilities in the past, and it's been used in a bunch of financial systems. So it's very well tested, and I'm sure, like everything else, it's like going into this new architecture, of these decentralized systems, and lots of things are new and surprising. But the object capability is an access control security method that actually fits the decentralized architecture.
I just want to check my understanding. So a way of leveraging those that adds a possibility that wasn't there before, I think, is like if I'm in a collective and there's someone external who I want just to do this one job for me, I can give them permission to just, I'll see you, Josh, bye. I can give them permission just to, oh, sorry, that was Christopher. Bye, Christopher. I can give them permission to just be able to update that specific record, and I don't have to like make them a user of the system and add them into my collective in order to do that. I can just go, for this one-off thing, you can change this record. Is that essentially what they give you?
Correct.
Cool.
And not only that, but once you give them that capability, it's like a key. And they if they have that capability, they can do it. However, you can revoke the capability if they do something you didn't like.
There was a question there from Christopher on room for external indexing services for cross-DNA searching and stuff. That's been an interesting topic that's been, sorry, on capabilities, a bearer token. Yeah, that encapsulates the meaning. That's a good way of conceptualizing capability tokens for the old web, I suppose. Yeah, for cross-DNA searching, it's been a long conversation, and in that modules in the Holo-REA framework, you'll see there's a section on the links module, which it didn't seem that important at the time when I started talking about it with Nicholas Luck back then, but he clued me onto the idea that actually if you made the links module primary, it opens up a whole lot of possibilities in how you associate data between networks that are quite interesting. Because it allows you to do things like, let's just imagine a petrochemical company that's like, sending a bunch of heavy metals into a river somewhere, and they're not tracking those waste flows. So they've got all this production data that says, look what we're producing, and it's all so clean and green because they're just hiding information. So with links being external to the data, it means that there can be some watchdog organization that has like a globally visible place where you can just put links, and that someone can come in and go, well, I'm going to spin up my own economic network and track all the waste flows and go down to the river and measure the mercury levels. And I can actually link that to your production outputs so that the world can see that, this is what I'm observing that's connected. So that feels like quite a radical piece of empowerment, just separating things out in that way. But I also, I'm kind of trying to walk this line of making sure, erring on the side that everybody has the most complete information possible at the moment. So in the Holo-REA implementation that stands, each of the network modules has links inside it as well. So we talked about satisfactions at the start between observation and planning. And there's links between the satisfaction and the events in observation, and there's links between the satisfaction and the intents and commitments in planning. So just that to say that there are links stored with the records, which is not to say that we couldn't duplicate data and store links in their own separate network externally to the records as well. But I did kind of like the idea that, if I've got access to this network, I should be able to understand the data that was linking into it. And I don't know if I'm that attached to that idea anymore, because there is the possibility that you could have a collaboration space that's just a whole bunch of loosely floating data that no one can make sense of unless you have access to this network that is kind of the linking information that makes that collaboration space make sense. But yeah, I don't know, they're kind of moving outside the norm fairly heavily, going into architectures like that. So I'm not sure where things will end up, but it's certainly interesting to think about. You're laughing, Josh. Are there interesting patterns like this you've played with?
I just think that prioritizing the relationships in that way is a really interesting way to think about stuff, as well as like what you want to associate with or associate and model essentially. Yeah, it just sounds radical. So I think that pattern.
Yeah, seeing as we're coming up to time, that might be a good segue into some weird stuff to finish on. I'll I'll share in the chat here this project of Nicholas Lux. He's calling it perspectivism, but this is an effort to sort of distill what he would call the quintessence of an agent-centric application interface. And so it's looking at the natural repercussions of this now that we've kind of talked about decomposing everything and separating everything out as much as possible. And we've talked about some ways that, you know, some third-party stuff like this resource booking thing or things like file uploads might be integrated easily. And they're all kind of integrated just by these assemblages of links, like just by us saying, well, I'm going to link economic events to files, and now I've got file attachments that I can put up to you know, add extra information about things I'm observing. So there's kind of a place where all this might converge, which is when we get to the point of, well, let's just decompose everything. Let's pull the whole interface apart and allow that kind of link space to be a space where you're linking different bits of UI, not just different bits of data. In that, something emerges with this project that is much greater than the sum of its parts, because suddenly the whole ecosystem of Holochain and all these other applications that people are building free game to pull in and pull apart and remix and recompose in whatever ways make sense. And there have been a few interesting conversations with different people. Tiberius was one of the people who started the thought for me, actually, because he had some reflections on, like, where is the center of the organization? What is the thing that people gather around and use as a springboard to kind of get stuff done? And in the code, the UI code, which we haven't done much of, that we've written for REA at the moment, the thing that's been sort of the center point is the marketplace, because a lot of these places, like Shiro was one of those projects, are looking at, you know, wanting exchange functionality to take the goods and services that they have in their ecosystem and make them meaningful to other neighboring communities. Those marketplaces have been kind of the de facto place that people end up in as a default, just because they're thinking about trading and sharing resources. But I actually don't think that a marketplace is a very fun place to be, really. You know, like, it's even this one that we have that's all about gifting and sharing, it's still a pretty sterile place to be. It's just a place that's got stuff that people have, and you can click through to it and, you know, accept offers and stuff, but that's about all you can do. There's no social interaction or no deeper information present there. And so that opens up a discussion as to what is the place that you'd want to be in to start with. And the Holo team have built this elemental chat app, and so making that a center point for some communities might make a lot of sense. You might want to start in a chat room, and we might want to build economic features into the chat, and that might be a springboard that you want to head off. The one that Tibi suggested that seems to have been working for Sensorica for a long time is the wiki. Like, the wiki is the central place where everything emerges from, and everybody kind of starts off in the wiki. For other places, it might be the task management system. It might be like blogs and people's writing. Like, that is all very dependent on the culture of the group. And so just all this to note that what we have here are building blocks that let people create and discover those spaces for themselves. And with this perspectivism effort and people starting to get more interested in that, that seems set to take off in a fairly major way. And the social network to watch with that are Junto, if folks here don't know them. And we've been having some really interesting conversations lately where we're kind of realizing that, like, oh, this long-term project of merging the social and economic layers together might actually be something that just happens organically and requires very little effort at all, because you know, if we talk a little bit and we make our UIs so that they're not at least garishly incompatible and look horrible when put next to each other, then, you know, there's just some common interfaces in this perspectivism thing that we can build towards. And that means that suddenly all of the social networking stuff that Junto does and all of the economic networking stuff that Holo-REA does can all just be merged together. And you can have a social network where you go into a space and the news feed disappears and is replaced with a marketplace or a wiki or a chat room or whatever it is that your group wants it to be. Yeah, so those are quite exciting. I look forward to that. Don't know what else to say. I think that's that's kind of the end of my trains of thought. But yeah, I might just make space for any last rounds of questions people have. I'm happy to stick around for a while and keep answering stuff.
Hello. Hi, Posby.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, you didn't introduce yourself.
Turn it on, it echoes. Okay. So yeah, I'm Thomas. Sorry, I didn't get to introduce myself at the beginning, but enjoying the conversation here with Josh. We're working together on projects here. I'm a Holochain developer myself. I probably see me on the network, but
Thomas Cal, right?
yeah, I'm really looking forward to exploring more of REA and learning more about like the whole approach and the perspective, and particularly interested in mutual credit, and perhaps someone we can have discussions on how to do that part, maybe starting with events. And so yeah, enjoying the stuff and hope to talk more about it.
Awesome. I'll pop a couple things in the chat for you. The first is a link to another one of Guillaume's mutual projects, which is a mutual credit implementation that he's been building, coming from the mutual credit space and really focusing on that as the core implementation. And the second one is a fairly simple issue actually that I put together as to what would be required to create a mutual credit system that runs on Holo-REA. So using that as the engine kind of thing. And yeah, we've made some plans to kind of loop back and you know, we can build REA as a layer into his mutual credit implementation, and we can make Holo-REA into a mutual credit implementation, and they should be equivalent. So that's an interesting exploration.
So
yeah, the other interesting thing about his mutual credit is that it's a private implementation. So all of the transactions are only done between counterparties, and there's no kind of global balance sheet. So that'd be the main difference there. And it'd be really interesting to see how REA maps to that.
So,
see you, Daniel.
Excuse me, sorry for interrupting, but could you possibly, could you please copy the chat and send it to everybody that at least you know about?
Sure.
Thanks.
Bob, I've been copying it also. I haven't.
I'm pretty sure Zoom saves it in the recording.
Thank you. Thank you. I can't do it on my phone, but yeah, that'd be good.
I have a question, if I may, around events, because I'm not sure I'm clear on those 100%, because you've been talking about them as observations as well as satisfactions. Is that, am I understanding right, or is that
separate things there? The satisfactions is more of a relational thing as to how you relate that observation to something else. But yeah.
Yeah, so it might satisfy something, or it might fulfill a commitment, or it might not, basically.
If you head to that link and scroll down a little bit, well, you know what, I might even, it'd be nice if I shared my screen while I was saying these things so the folks at home know what's going on. Yeah, so is that visible? It might be a bit big. Sorry, wrong page. So yeah, on the flows page of the Value Flows website, under timeline, plans and observations. So this kind of explains how those temporal relationships work. So this is like out to the future here, then to the past, and the present moment here. So events only happen in the past because like once you've logged the event, the thing has already been and gone. And then commitments reach a bit further, and events reach a bit further into the, intents reach a bit further into the future as well. And these are the two relationships between. So the events satisfy the commitments, and the commitments fulfill the intents. But in terms of event, commitment, and intent, they're all pretty much the same record. Like there's some minor differences, but they're really just, you know, letting you specify the quantities and specificity of things differently, because when you log the intent, you might not even know who wants to be involved, and you might not know how many, but by the time you've made the commitment, there might be some quantities and people involved, and then you get to the event and you're on the hard actuals. So yeah, that's how that kind of binding works.
Thanks, that clarifies a bit. Appreciate it.
Awesome. I hope that helps. Cool. Well, I might wrap up. Any other final thoughts from anyone before we head off? Hi, John. Sorry you dropped in late. Yeah, we're just about wrapping up, but the recording will be online soon.
Yeah, I only just found out about it. My time converter was an hour out.
Ah, dear. Yeah, I was hoping there hadn't been a daylight saving switch or something.
Well, it's not supposed to be. UTC is supposed to be the same as GMT at the moment, but something went wrong somewhere. Doesn't matter. I'll catch the recording. That's great.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, stay posted on the Holochain forum. There will be more conversations coming up soon, and probably the next ones will be resource booking modules, and Guillaume and I talking through how that, or how we've gone and adapted that to be REA compatible and what that looks like. And I don't know if there's other ones too. I know I'm forgetting, but yeah, lots of things. They'll be on the forum.
Thanks very much, Plosby. It was fantastic discussion.
No worries, Tim. Yeah, glad you could make it. I hope it was useful.
Yeah, very much.
Alrighty. See you all later.
Thanks, Plosby. Take care.
You too. Cheers.